A couple of months ago, I made this video on the channel, which was all about authentication in React. That video covered all of the important concepts and mental models required to implement authentication, not only in a React application, but also in a general web application. The video covered topics like access and refresh tokens, how to handle and manage those tokens, what does the client do, what does the server do, and how to orchestrate everything together to create a complete authentication flow in React. Now, one of the things that the video did not cover was that it did not show an actual code implementation of how to take all of these concepts that we've learned and actually implement them through code in a real application. There was some code in the video that I showed at the end, but that was code that was already pre-written by me, and I didn't actually show from start to finish how to actually create a complete authentication system. So that's exactly what this video that you're currently watching is for. In this video, we're going to take all of the concepts that we've learned in the previous video, and we're actually going to use them to build a complete and secure authentication system from scratch in React. Think of this as the sequel to that video, as the part 2, where we actually, this time, go into the implementation. We're going to cover both the front end and the back end because we need both to create a full system, and we're also going to be using a library called SuperTokens to handle all of our authentication. SuperTokens is an open source authentication library, and they're also sponsoring this video. So get ready, get excited, because you are going to learn a lot in this video. Let's get into it. All right, cool. So let's begin. So here, as usual, I have a very simple application with some boilerplate code already set up for us to start working in and actually implement our authentication system. So what I have here is kind of the index page, right? The home page or the dashboard, if you will, that has here the current authentication state of the user, which for now is not logged in, right? Because we haven't implemented any authentication. And then we have two buttons here to sign in and sign up. If I press sign up, for example, it is going to take us to another page, another route in the application with a simple form to allow the user to sign up and create an account. Now, currently in this form, there's nothing actually set up. So if I type any email or password and press sign up here, nothing is actually going to happen, which of course is expected because we're going to have to come in here and actually add that functionality to our form. Now, for this video, we're going to be keeping things simple and beginner friendly, and we're only going to focus on email and password, even though SuperTokens, our authentication library, actually supports many other sign-in options that I'm also going to go quickly over later on in this video. So that's our first step, right? Implement authentication using email and password. Then what we want to do is once we have that set up, the next step is for us to actually get the authentication state of the current user. So here, instead of not logged in, after the user has created an account, we want to actually show a welcome message, right? Perhaps even with the user's ID, right? The user ID is really useful because we can then use that in the application to do things on behalf of the authenticated user. And then after we did that, we're also going to allow the user to log out of the application, right? Which makes sense. This is a feature that is pretty much essential, right? You can sign in and of course you can sign out of the application. That should then update here to again say not logged in. And then finally, I'm also going to show you how to implement a very simple user management flow, if you will, where we're actually going to allow the user to update their credentials to sign in, which means that we're going to allow the user to change the email that they're actually going to use to sign in to the application, right? And that is going to cover everything that we need to know about implementing an authentication solution. And through this, you're going to see the power of using something like SuperTokens because their tools and their functionalities actually do a lot of the heavy lifting for us and allow us to focus on what matters for us, right? Which is building an actual useful and valuable application. So now that we have our plan, let's actually begin. Now, the first thing that we want to do is come here to SuperTokens and actually sign in and create an account because we need some API keys and some URLs from them to actually integrate into our application. So SuperTokens, right, on top of being an open source authentication library, is really meant to be a sort of alternative to things like Auth0 or AWS Cognito or similar. The fact that it's open source actually has a lot of benefits, right? First of all, the code is open, so anyone can see it, anyone can vet its security, which is really important when you're dealing with an authentication solution, right? That's like one of the most crucial parts of a web application. You want it to be secure. But this also means that you can take their code and self-host it completely for free and have 100% control on your own data, right? Which is really, really important, especially when you're working in enterprise, right? Data privacy is a huge concern, and it's really cool that they allow you to do this essentially for free. Now, outside of the open source nature of the library, one of the things that is most important for us as the developers, specifically as React developers, is the actual functions and tools that they allow us to use through their SDK to actually integrate into our own functionality to have all of the features of authentication. You're going to see that they make life really, really easy for us, while at the same time giving us a very robust authentication solution. So I'm very, very excited to be using this, and I'm very thankful that they are sponsoring this video. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to create an account, right? I already have an account, so I have a dashboard here. Essentially, once you create an account, you're going to be redirected to their dashboard here. Now, you might get a little welcome flow. I did get that at some point. If you do, just go ahead and add your actual technologies that you're using. But essentially, after that, you will be brought to this core management page where you have to actually create a core for your application. Now, this core is essentially the managed service that they host for you, right? Which gives you all of the magic and all of the functionalities of handling the authentication. They have two options. They have managed and self-hosted, right? So you can choose which one that you want. For us, we're going to choose here managed, right? And then we're going to choose a region over here. We have two options. We have Ireland or USA. I'm going to choose Ireland because it is closest to me geographically. But they say here that you can actually support more AWS regions. You just have to reach out to their sales email as well. We're not going to do that. Ireland is fine for us. Then we're just going to hit deploy, and it's going to take a few seconds to actually deploy our core. Great. So now we have a core here. It's called My App 1. It's of type development. With this version, we're going to click into it. And now this is going to give us here some connection URI and then an API key over here, which are crucial because we're going to need this to actually set up the authentication solution. So we're going to keep this here because now we're going to come here to the documentation. We're going to open this in a new tab. And now we're actually going to start integrating SuperTokens, their SDK, into our React frontend. So I'm going to come here. Let's maybe make this a little bit bigger. I'm going to come here to quick start. I'm going to go here to front end setup. And here we have two options. We can use their pre-built UI, which they have some components that you can use, or we can use our custom UI, which we are going to use, and basically just use their SDK as the functionality layer in our UI. Because as you saw, we already have our UI here, right? It's a very simple bare bones chat CN UI, but we have it here. It works. All we want is to actually just have the authentication part of this UI setup. So we're going to scroll here, and first we need to install the SuperTokens WebJS library. So let's come here to our editor, and let's come here to the client. And I'm going to show you the server as well in just a moment, but I need to maybe add pnpm add SuperTokens WebJS, and that is then going to install our library. Perfect, that is done. Let's go back to the documentation and let's see our next step. And then the next step is going to be to initialize SuperTokens, right? They have here a handy form that you can actually plug your values into it, and it's basically just going to update these fields over here, right? But essentially, we can just skip all that and we can just copy all of this code over here, and this is going to be the actual initialization of the SuperTokens SDK. So we need to call supertokens.init, and then we need to pass it an object with the app info property, our domain, the base path, and the app name, and then a recipe list, which essentially means what functionalities do we want inside of our application. Based on what we provide here in the recipe list, that is going to unlock for us some specific functionalities. For example, the session, right? I believe this is required because you kind of need the session for all of this to work. That's going to be all of the session functionality of the access tokens and so on of the user. And then email and password, which is going to unlock for us the ability for users to log in using email and password. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy all of this here, and we're going to go to our application over here. And here in our files, we have a lib folder over here for libraries. We're just going to create one that's going to be called SuperTokens.ts, and here we're going to paste the code from the documentation. And now we're going to set this up, right? Because we already have installed the library, everything should work exactly as we expect. Now here, the API domain, this is specifically where our API is going to live, right? So as I said at the beginning, we're going to need both a front end and a backend for this. Now our backend is already set up for this application because I wanted this to be focused on the front end only. So we're going to come here, index server.src, and this is going to be here our actual backend. So the backend is pretty simple. simple. It is a Node Express application, and it's literally all in this one file, and it's not that much to it. What we're doing here is we have a very similar supertokens.init. This one is specifically for the backend. So you would need to do this in your own backend as well, but you don't have to use Express. You can use anything else that you want. They support a bunch of libraries and frameworks, including Next.js. And then here we pass some properties like the connection URI and the API key. This is specifically the ones that come from over here, right? Think of this as the backend, right? The connection URI is the actual URL of the managed instance of SuperTokens, and the API key is the key that you use to access that managed instance, right? So these are these properties over here. And then we have app info, which we also have in the front end. Here we can put the app name. I put here complete authentication system React, the API domain, right? Which is here. If I just open up the env in the server, you're going to see that the API domain is this one over here, localhost /5000, and I believe I changed this to 8,000 rather. So let's change this to 8,000. Yeah, 8,000 is the one. And then the website domain, which is going to be the website, the front end website that we're going to be connecting from to the backend. Because right, for all of this to work, the front end is going to have to talk to the backend, and the backend needs to know where it needs to answer the front end to. And that is going to be here. HTTP localhost and then 3000. That is going to be the actual URL of our front end, which is this one right here. It's using 10-stack router, right? And this one is set up and configured to run on localhost port 3000. Then we have the API base path. So all of these authentication things are going to live under /auth, right? Because what essentially SuperTokens does is it takes your framework, whatever you're using, and it actually adds root to it. It adds endpoints that you can then call. And then the front-end system, the front-end functions that we're going to use and call, they're going to call those specific backend endpoints. That's how this works, right? We don't have to do it manually. We just configure where those endpoints are, and then the SDK handles everything else for us automatically, which is one of the big benefits of using something like SuperTokens. And then the website base path is essentially on the website, where is all of the authentication stuff going to live, right? We're going to have some authentication stuff, like we have our sign in and sign out form. They're going to come under the /auth. Everything that is related to authentication, we're going to put both on the backend and the front end under /auth. And then over here, just like in the front end, we have some recipes, the session, the email and password, and I also put dashboard here because I was just testing this out a little bit, but we're just going to start with email and password to keep things very simple. Then we have our normal Express app, right, which you would just run by calling Express. You set the port here, which is 8,000. Then we use this middleware here, this body parser, to actually get the body from our individual requests. Then we have our course policy, which allows the origin of our app base URL. So the front end, we put here content type as headers, and then we spread all of the course headers of SuperTokens, right? So they just give us all of these headers, and we can just use them and spread them super easily without having to manage them. And then we set credentials true to essentially allow our credentials to be passed from the front end to the back end. Then we call app.useMiddleware, right, which is pretty typical with Express. Then we create a test route over here just to make sure that everything works on our backend. This is going to return a message that says the server is running with SuperTokens. And then we have one route over here, which is app.post, and that is going to be to change our email. This one we're going to look at a little bit later when we actually implement the ability to change emails. And then over here, we have this error handler over here, and then we can actually get some custom errors and do whatever we want with them. So whenever we have an error here, we can just console log the error, return a status 500 or whatever. We can log this to Sentry, whatever that we want. And then finally, we're going to call app.listen, pass it the port, and then console log that everything is working exactly as we expect. If we look here in our server and I do pnpm dev, you're going to see that our server is going to run, and we have here server running on localhost 8000, SuperTokens API available at 8000 /auth. We are good to go. So back here in the front end, the API domain, right, that is going to be localhost /8000, but we actually have this inside of an environment here, or maybe I don't. And actually I didn't have an environment, but I just created it here. So I followed the same patterns that we have in the backend, which essentially means to use Zod, create here the schema for the actual validation. We have here the Vite API base URL that is going to be string and then URL. And then we're just going to export the env, which is going to take the schema and parse it using import.meta.env, which is specific to Vite, which is what we're using here. Our env here, if you just open it up, so we have env here, it basically just lists the Vite API base URL as localhost 8000, and we are good to go. So now with this, we can import our env and we can just paste it here. And now we have the Vite API base URL all set up. The API base path, we're going to leave it as is because we said that everything backend and frontend that is authentication related is going to be on /auth. And then the app name, I'm just going to come in here and just put the same app name that I have here, just to make it consistent with what we had before, complete authentication system React. And for our recipe list, we're just going to keep session and email password, and that is going to be it. All right, so now that we have this, we can actually go back here to the documentation and proceed with the next steps, because the documentation is really useful. And if you're setting this up yourself, you should actually use it because they go over a lot of very important things. The next step is actually to add the login UI. So we're going to add our sign up form, which again, we already have created. So here, if I believe they're not showing the actual form, that's perfectly fine. What we have to do here is this is a asynchronous function that they call signup clicked. We can actually create our own function that we can call whatever we want. This is the function that we call whenever the user actually presses sign up into our form. So this is the function that is actually going to log in the user and set the session and manage all of that for us. The beauty of this is that we can import sign up from SuperTokens and their email password recipe, and we can just call it with the form fields, so the email and the password, and based off of that, they are going to go call our backend, right, which now has been integrated with SuperTokens, so it runs correctly. It's going to call our backend, it's going to create the session, manage all of it for us, and then return to us a response that we can then respond to in the front end over here and actually do whatever we want. Did the authentication work in? Did the sign up work in? Did it not? Right? And we can actually respond accordingly. And this is really cool because you get to actually integrate this into your existing solution and do it the way that you want to do it, right? And integrate the flow that you want. But at the same time, you don't have to manage all of this stuff with the access tokens and stuff like that, which can get very complicated, right? They do a lot of things behind the scenes, like they set the token into your cookies or the headers. You can actually configure this, and then they actually intercept your request going through and back to the backend to actually send that token right alongside. They handle refreshing the token and all of that for you, and all you have to do is call the sign up or sign in function, and that's it, right? You get the best of both worlds. So let's do that, right? Let's actually take this try catch block over here and let's integrate it directly into our own application. So let's come back here, and now we're going to go here. We have a sign up form component over here, which is your standard React hook form, simple form component setup, right? So we have a form schema here defined with an email and a password. Then we have our component here, which uses the use form hook from React hook form, passes the form schema. We use the auth resolver, and we set empty strings as default values. Then we have our handle submit, right, which is basically now just console logging the data. And then we have the actual UI, which are ShadCN components that are made to work with React hook form. So what we have to do is come here into our handle submit, and we can just paste the actual functionality of SuperTokens, which again is really cool because we can integrate this directly into React hook form. If we were using Next.js or something, we could integrate it there as well. Whatever we were using, we could integrate it because it's simply a function call that you would anyways have to do even if you weren't using SuperTokens. If you're using something else, you would have to call some sort of function, either from whatever else you're using or your own custom function if you're doing it yourself, and you would still have to do all of that functionality of the tokens that SuperTokens does automatically for you. So let's come here and let's fix our errors. First, we're going to make this asynchronous. Then we're going to import the signup function. And here we're going to put data.email and data.password. And now we have a response here, which we can actually respond to. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this into a const because we actually won't be changing any properties of it. And here we can actually handle our specific errors. So here, if response.status equals field error, this means that one of the input form fields failed validation. Maybe the email is incorrect, maybe something went wrong with the password, right? If that happens, we can actually map over each of these fields over here and then check which field it was and actually show an error. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to remove this code over here because we can actually make this a little bit simpler. We can just map over each individual field and connect it to React hook form and then set a root error on the form. So I'm just going to take all of this piece of code here and just replace it with this. So what we're doing here is we're just calling response.formFields.forEach. So for each field inside of our response, then we're going to call form.setError, and we're going to call formField.id as key of form schema so that TypeScript knows that this is actually a valid key. And we're going to pass it here the message and the formField.error. So what this is doing is this is taking the form fields from the response, so from SuperTokens, and mapping over each one of them. And then for every error that they have, we're manually setting it into our form on the actual field ID. I think I said root before. We're not doing root just now for this part. We're actually setting the error on the specific field, which is really cool because this directly integrates SuperToken into our custom form solution using React hook form. Then coming here, if response.status equals sign up not allowed, so if for some reason the user is not allowed to sign up, then what we can do is now we're actually going to take this and now we're going to put an error on the root. So we're going to call form.setError and then put the root here and then pass the message response.reason. That is going to set an error on the global form, letting the user know that something went wrong and they're not allowed to sign up. And finally, else if the sign up was successful, then what we want to do is essentially redirect the user to the home page. In our case, this is what it's going to look like. We're going to call the navigate function from here. It's going to be from TanStack router. We're going to call the use navigate hook that is going to give us the navigate function. And then here, we're going to navigate to the index page as well. And then over here in the error, what I'm going to do is in both cases, I'm just going to console log the error because again, console log the error over here. I always like to put error just because that's the way that I like it. We're going to console log the error over here, and we're not really going to worry about this because this is simply for a video and it's just for tutorial purposes and I want to keep things simple. All right, so let's test this out. Let's see how this works now. So let's go here to our actual application, make sure that we're on the auth/signup and we have page could not be found. Why is this? Right, because our actual application wasn't running. So let's now refresh and now this actually is going to work. Great. Now we're on the sign up page. So let me just put here my email demo@cosdensolutions.io. Then we're going to do Cosden Solutions and I'm going to put 1 here and I'm going to press sign up and it's going to load for a while and it did not work. Oh, right. We did not actually initialize the super token. So what we did, the error here is saying that we have no instance of email password found. Ensure that we call .init on it. Our mistake here was that if we go here to the super tokens lib that we have here, we have this, but we actually haven't imported this anywhere. This is just a standalone file. We need to come here to our main.tsx and we need to actually put it here so that we import the lib super tokens. That is then going to give us access and actually initialize all of the super tokens SDK. So let's try it again, but first let me just make a small adjustment here. So we can actually, in our button here, we can put disabled and it's going to be form state that is submitting, and then if submitting we're going to put signing up just so that we have some visual UI that we're actually signing up. So let's now try again. We're going to put demo and I'm going to do Cosden Solutions 1. Don't steal my password. Signing up, and there we go. I mean, we got redirected to our home screen, which essentially tells us that we are signed in, but we're still seeing not logged in and we're still seeing this over here. That's fine. That's exactly what we expect because we didn't actually implement the user session part, accessing the user session. So that's exactly our next step, because authentication is not only about signing the user in and signing them out, it's also about managing their session, accessing it in the front end, and then doing things with them, right? Like showing their logged in state, right? And then allowing the user to do things like change their email and actually perform operations as the signed in user. So for that, we're going to come here to our Explorer here, and inside of components, we're going to create an auth provider component. This auth provider is going to be responsible for handling and managing the user session. It's going to query the user session and actually get it, and it's going to provide some helper functions to actually update the state of the user session so that we can actually have access to it inside of our application. This is really important because, again, it's one of the core principles of an authentication system. So first, let's start as we usually do. Let's create the types for this context here. So this context is going to have an is authenticated. It's going to be a Boolean. it's then going to have the user ID, so the user ID of the actual user that is signed in, or null. Then it's going to have a function that we can call handle sign in that is going to receive this user ID and then return void, and another function to sign out the user. Then over here, we're going to create our provider context here using the create context function from React. And then we're going to come in here and do function auth provider. And we're going to create the basic form and let cursor autocomplete for us the basic form of our auth provider. Now here cursor is on the right track, so we're going to import useState over here. We're going to need to have state values for isAuthenticated and user ID that are going to be managed by this auth provider and then provided to the rest of our application. We should also export this component over here because we will need to import it and wrap our entire application with it. Then over here, we need to, I'm going to remove this provider here because in React 19, it's no longer necessary. You can just do it like this and it works completely fine. And then as the value, we're going to provide isAuthenticated user ID. And then we need to create our functions handle sign in and handle sign out. So our handle sign in function, let's create it. So we're going to do function and then handle sign in. It is going to take the user ID. And what this is going to do is it's just going to take a user ID and it's going to set isAuthenticated to true. And it's going to set the user ID to the user ID. Now, this might sound confusing. Why are we having a handle sign in function here when in our signup form, we have a signup function here, right? Which we will also have the equivalent of the sign in function. And here's where the difference happens. So this one is the one that is actually going to call the backend and sign the user in to SuperTokens on the backend, right? That is going to return to us a response. But as you've seen in our application over here, that response is not stored anywhere. It is stored in our cookies or our headers, right? So we know that we are actually authenticated, but our front end, our client code is not aware of it. So we also need to store this token over here, this user ID. We need to store it in state so that the rest of our components can actually access it, right? It's not enough to just have it inside of our headers. We also need to have it as some sort of state in memory so that we can use it in our components in our front-end React app. And that's what this function does. This takes in the user ID that's already been signed in from SuperTokens when we called the backend, and then just sets it on the front end state so that we have access to it. That's all that it does. So you're going to see we're going to take this one here and we're just going to put it right here before we navigate here. We're just going to call handle sign in. I'm not going to do it now. I'm just going to finish the rest of this component here, but that's essentially what we're going to do. And then we need to do the exact same thing for the sign out, but that is going to be the reverse, right? When the user clicks sign out, we're just going to set isAuthenticated to false and set user ID to null. Again, this is only going to be for the front end. We first need to sign out the user with SuperTokens on the back end by calling the sign out function from SuperTokens, right? So it's always a two-step process, one for the back end and one for the front end. Great. So now that we have this, all of our values here are provided to our provider, which is fine. I'm just going to create here and export a use auth hook, which we're going to use to consume this provider here. I'm going to import the use hook from React instead of use context, because now in React, this is how you actually create and consume a context. And now we can use this whenever we want to access the authenticated state or the user ID of the user, or call any of these sign in or sign out functions. Great. So now with this, let's come here to our root, which is the root of the 10-stack router. So this is going to wrap every single one of our roots. And here we're going to call and wrap everything with the auth provider so that now we actually have our auth provider. This means that anywhere in our application, we can now come here and we can call the use auth hook. And then based off of that, we can just access is the user authenticated or not. So now if we come here to our sign up form, now we can come here, and because we now have access to our auth, we can come here and then use handle sign in from use auth, import this from the provider. And then right before we navigate, we can then call handle sign in, and we can do response.user.id, I believe. That is going to be the ID of the user, which is a property of type string. We only have access to this here because no other errors happen, and here we're guaranteed a successful sign up response. And then we can go here to our index in our roots over here. And now this is authenticated, which has previously been hard coded to false. We can actually get it from the use auth over here. And if we have is authenticated, now what we're going to do is we're going to show the welcome. And here I'm going to put a button with sign out, but for now it's just going to remain empty. We're going to add the functionality later. Let's see if this actually works. So if I refresh here, obviously nothing happens because we haven't configured that yet. But if I go here to sign in and I put here demo and then Cosden, 1 and I press sign in, now you're gonna see, oh, right, yeah, we actually forgot to implement the sign in functionality. So let's come here and let's take this entire handle submit function over here. Let's go to sign in form because now it's just console logging it, which obviously we don't want now that we have actually everything set up. Here, instead of sign up, it's going to be sign in, which we're going to import from email and password. And it should be exactly the same. And actually, it's a little bit different. We're going to come here and do this. We have to check the same field error as before. And here we should also check the wrong credentials error. So because we're signing in, we can actually put wrong credentials that don't belong to an account. So we can then set a root error with invalid email or password. And then we can check sign in not allowed and then set a similar root error with the response.reason. Otherwise, we can then call handle sign in and call the navigate function, which we need to access as hooks. So let's let cursor be very helpful and do all of it for us. Wonderful. And now we should be good to go. So now if you come back here, now we're going to do demo and then cosden solutions 1 because I'm number 1. And now we're going to be, let's see, there we go. Now we see welcome here and we can see our sign out button. It works exactly as we expect. Wonderful. So this works now. Now we have actual access to the user session from our component. The only problem is if I refresh, now it's gone and we lost track of it, even though we're still signed into the application. So how do we fix that? Well, it's actually really simple. We have to come back here to our auth provider, which again is responsible for providing the authentication state to the user. So it also makes sense that we give it the responsibility of getting the authentication state of the user to then be able to provide it to our application. And the way that we're going to do that is here, we're going to define an asynchronous function that we're going to call, not check auth, we're going to call handle auth state. And here, this one is basically going to get and check the authentication state of the user. And then that is going to set the state. We're going to set the state inside of this function to then provide it to our application. So first, what we want to do is we want to get the session using the does session exist from SuperTokens and again, the session recipe. This is really cool because again, we don't have to do that. We just call this does session exist function and it checks it automatically, right? It checks it. I'm not sure exactly how, but it checks it and it figures out the access token, the refresh token, is it valid? And then it provides us the actual session here that we can use. Now with this, we can do, if we have a session, then we can do const user ID equals to await get user ID, again from SuperTokens recipe and then the session. That is going to give us here the user ID. And if we have that, then we can actually do set is authenticated to true, set user ID to the user ID. Otherwise, if you don't have a session, we can just set it to false and then set the user ID to null, right? So this is now going to check and set the state based on the actual user ID of the session. This is really cool. This is SuperTokens integrated with our own custom solutions. And finally, to get this, what we need to do is essentially on a use effect over here, we can just run this on mount and we can directly call this one over here so that whenever we are mounting this component, we first check the authentication session, we put it here, and we are good to go. Every single point after that, when we sign in, when we sign out, basically we're going to be updating that piece of state. And every single time that we refresh, we're going to get the fresh state of the user. So if I now refresh, you're going to see for a split second, sometimes it shows for a split second while we fetch the actual authentication, we're going to see not authenticated. But every single time after that, we're going to be sign in, right? Exactly as we expect. Fantastic. What we can also do now is we can actually get the user ID over here. So we can come here to our index file and here we can also get the user ID, right, which is a property. And here we can just do welcome and then just put the user ID here just so that, there you go, welcome user ID. And now we can use this user ID that is authenticated, identifies the user to do anything that we want on behalf of that user. Wonderful. Now let's allow the user to sign out of the application, which is the logical next step. So for that, it is pretty simple. We're going to come here to our sign out button. And this just needs to take an on-click function, which is going to be an arrow function like this. And here we're going to do two things. We're going to do sign out from SuperTokens, right? Again, it's always going to be a two-step process that is going to sign out the user in from the actual backend from SuperTokens. And then we're going to come here and we're going to get our handle sign out function. And no cursor, I want both. It's a two-step process. You weren't listening to the video. Come on, cursor. Handle sign out. There you go. right? So we first sign out from SuperTokens, then we sign out in our application, right? And now everything should work exactly as we expect. So now we're here, I can press sign out and we're not logged in anymore. And if I refresh the page, we are not logged in, right? And this works exactly as we expect. I can come here, Cosden Solutions, and I can press sign in, and we're going to sign in. We refresh, we're sign in, and now we can sign out. We have a complete authentication system implemented. All right, now let me quickly show you how you would go about changing the user's email, just because I want to show you some really cool things about the backend that is very important when you're working with SuperTokens. But again, I'm going to go a little bit quicker because it's something that we've already done before in the front end. So I'm going to come in here to our components, and I'm just going to create a change email form.tsx, and I'm just going to paste this code over here. Again, it is basically a similar form using React hook form. We have the form schema. This one will just take in the email over here. And then we have a form on handle submit. We're now going to call this fetch/change email. We're going to manually call our backend because this is not a functionality that is provided from SuperTokens, although they provide the actual functions that we can use in the backend to change the email, but we have to call our own backend this time. So we're going to call the change email over here. We're going to pass the body as the JSON stringified version of the data, headers content type, and then if we have a not good response, we're going to set a root error. Otherwise, we're just going to navigate to the homepage. And then here we have the simple chat.cn UI form components, nothing fancy. Now the next step is to go inside of our roots over here inside of auth, and here I'm going to do change email over here .tsx. That is going to create a root for me, which I'm just going to override it here. I'm just going to add this change email form over here so that we can actually use it and see it inside of our app. Then in our index, what we have to do is maybe right above this button, we can just do a link here to auth/change email, and we can pass here a link to allow the user to change their email, which now we have to sign in to actually see that link. There you go. Now we have welcome, we can press change email, and now we have a form here to change our email address. Right, so on the front end, it's pretty simple, right? The only thing that we have to do is on submit, we just call this API endpoint. So now let me show you the API endpoint because I want to show you another cool thing about using SuperTokens. So if we go here to the SuperTokens server, the Express server that we have, and we scroll here, this is our post change email route over here, right? So we have /change email, right? The cool thing about this is our own route inside of our own backend framework, right? We're using Express. We would have something similar if we were using Next.js or anything else. We define our own custom route over here, and then we call this verify session function from SuperTokens, which is similar in concept to every other function that we called from SuperTokens. What this does is this checks if the user has a valid session, and only if they do will it allow you to actually run this code. Essentially, it's protecting the route, right, to make sure that only an authenticated user is able to access this route. Which makes sense. Only an authenticated user should be able to change their email address. And it's really cool because just like in the front end, you just call one function and it does everything for you automatically. So you just integrate that function into whatever it is that you're using, right? It doesn't force you to change anything that you're doing, but at the same time, it doesn't force you to do all the nitty-gritty stuff of managing the sessions, the tokens, and everything that comes with it. And then with that, now here, you're guaranteed to actually have a user over here, right? So we can get the session from request.session, and here we tell TypeScript, hey, we know that there's a session because we verified the session before and we wouldn't be here if we don't have a session. And then based off of that, we just get the email from the body over here. We parse the email to make sure that it's a valid email, which is something that you should do inside of an application. Then if the parse failed, we basically return invalid email address. And then here we call email password dot update email or password. We pass it the recipe user ID, which we get session.getRecipe user ID. Again, we don't have to manage those user IDs. And then we pass the email over here, and then that's it. The email is going to be updated. Granted, of course, some errors can happen, right? Like the email already exists. If it's somebody else's email, that won't work. Or if for some reason the email change is not allowed, that can also happen, right? Or some other internal server error, right? As always, that can happen. So you just return those to the user, to the front end, and let the front end deal with them. And that's it, right? With this, you define your own custom endpoint with custom functionality to change the email, and it works using the individual pieces from SuperTokens. This is phenomenal, and this saves you so much time because you can make so many mistakes with all of these things and the tokens and stuff like that. And if you just let SuperTokens, which is open source, it's vetted, do it all for you, it's so much simpler and it just makes sense. So let's test this out. Let's come here. Let's go to demo 1 over here, and we're going to change our new email address over here. And there we go. Now we have our email address. Now we're going to come in here. We're going to try to sign in with the old email address. Let's see if this works. Oh, we're not getting an error here because I forgot to put the root error. That was my mistake. We're getting a root error from the form, but we have to do form.errors.root. There we go. And now if I sign in, there we go, invalid email or password. That's exactly what we expect, right? Again, this front-end UI stuff is just for demo purposes. It's not complete. You would obviously do things a little bit better, but again, the point of the video is not to focus on the front-end components, is to focus on the authentication system as a whole. So if we, instead of demo 1, we put demo 1. Did I get the password wrong? And there we go. That worked with demo 1. We got our user here and everything works exactly as we expect. So that's it. Now we have a full end-to-end authentication system with a little sneak peek of what it would be like to actually manage a user session and allow the user to change some details about themselves. Now, a couple of very important things here. This video was mostly tailored to beginners, right? That's generally who I make the videos for in my audience. And so a lot of these things are simplified, right? Like the actual UI, the components, right? It's not meant to be like a professional grade application. It's meant to teach you the individual concepts, to teach them to you in a realistic way, so that you can go out and actually implement them into your own applications. Also, for example, right, when changing an email here, you wouldn't just require the user to just change their email simply without verifying either their old email or even the new email address. I didn't want to do that because that would add unnecessary complexity to this video, which is already super long already, right? So just keep those things in mind. Also, going here to the documentation of SuperTokens, there's a bunch more things that I did not cover that are very much worth it to cover. For example, they have passwordless login, right? Where you actually send a link to the user's email and let them sign up through that email. We didn't cover this at all, right? This is something that you might want to do in your application. We have social login, right? Using Gmail or GitHub or whatever to log into the application. They have a very similar and simple setup to also do exactly these things, right? We didn't cover that because again, it would make the video too long and too complicated and would defeat the purpose of teaching you simple basic authentication. And right, they have a bunch more things like additional verification. You have multi-factor verification, right? You can have user roles, and then based on the user role, you can actually allow different parts of the application, right? There's a lot that you can go through this. You can manage sessions, right? There's a lot that I did not have the time to cover because again, I wanted to focus on what is actually important. And finally, the last thing that I wanted to show you is if you go here to the core management, you go here to your actual core. This is very important, is you have your configuration. This is where you can actually set different properties for the access tokens, right? So although you don't manage the tokens yourself directly, you can configure how they are managed. Like how long is an access token valid for? This is now an hour, right? But you can actually change it to whatever you want. Is there some blacklisting involved, right? Is there signing keys, right? There's a lot of different things. How long is the refresh token valid for? Password reset, and so on, right? This is really cool because if you're not doing this yourself, if you're not handling the actual tokens yourself, it's really cool that they allow you to actually customize some of these values to fit with the specific needs of your application. So yeah, SuperTokens is really cool. I really enjoyed setting it up for this video and showing you all the different pieces together. And I genuinely think that there is value in using something like this because again, they do a lot of the thing for you, but they allow you full customizability to integrate it into your own applications as you've just seen, right? It was smooth as butter, everything worked flawlessly, and we got a full authentication solution using SuperTokens. If you want to try out SuperTokens for yourself, visit supertokens.com. It's going to be the first link in the description. Create an account, create a core, test this out, see how you like it, see how you feel about it, and implement your own authentication solution now that you know how. The library is doing really well. It has 14,000 stars on GitHub, which is a good signal that it's a good library used by many people. And if you want to contribute as you're using it, feel free to do so. Again, it's open source, which makes this all that much better. And regarding all of this code that we set up over here, you're going to be able to find a link to this repository in the description down below. make sure to check it out, play around with it. Do your own version of it, compare your version to my version, right? But keep in mind, this was done just for a video, so it's not going to be perfect, and it was never intended to be perfect. It was intended to be a solution that I can use to teach you authentication in React with SuperTokens. So that's it. That's all that I have for you in this video. Big shout out again to SuperTokens for sponsoring this video. I had a blast. It was really fun. I hope that you enjoyed this as well. Like and subscribe and comment if you liked the video, and I will see you in the next one. My name is Darius Kozin. This is Cloud Solutions. Ciao, ciao.